Jewish persecution and extermination did not elicit from the Western Allies a response equal to the horrors of the Holocaust. Instead, Jewish refugees who hoped to flee Europe and Jewish organizations that tried to pioneer rescue operations were faced with endless obstacles or blank refusal and only occasionally grudging support. In the full knowledge of what happened, post war generations have been equally harsh in judging the moral failure of the Allied cause. The reasons for that failure are many. In the first place, the problem of coping with the Jewish refugees in the 1930s had prompted, particularly for the British administration in Palestine, strong negative reaction against providing further assistance. Secondly, there was the problem of credibility. As the horrors unfolded, the glimpses afforded to the Western public seemed to defy belief, even among Jewish communities. Believe the unbelievable, wrote the World Jewish Congress Bureau in London to the New York headquarters. The atrocity stories in the West were treated with caution after the experience of the First World War, and the journalists who filed the details from Europe had to break through what Leon Kubovitsky, addressing the World Jewish Congress in 1948, termed a crust of skepticism. The press was shy of repeating the same story again and again because its news value was rated poorly in comparison with war news. The New York Times, America's foremost daily paper, ran 24,000 front page articles during the war years, but only 44 covered Jewish issues. The Jewish American owner, Arthur Sulzberger, hesitated to use his paper to push the Jewish tragedy too far, from fear of alienating his readership or generating an anti Semitic response. As a result, public knowledge of the Holocaust was patchy and episodic, and likely to inspire incredulity rather than empathy. The death struggle in which the Jewish people were engaged, continued Kubovitsky in his speech, was not only incredible to the human mind, it was also incomprehensible. The failure might also be explained by anti Semitism, but this too is more complex an issue than it seems. In all three major Allied states, anti Semitism in its crude racist form was present, though not as a mainstream movement and not at the level of government. In the United States, popular anti Semitism increased during the 1930s. The slogan New Deal, Jew Deal was thrown by the extreme right at Roosevelt's economic reforms in the 1930s. Populist anti-Semitism was represented by William Paley and his 15,000 fascist silver shirts, by the Reverend Gerald Winrod, whose anti-Semitic paper Defender was read by 100,000 Americans, and by Father Charles Cowlin, the radio priest and a believer in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, whose anti-Semitic tirades reached an audience of millions until he was silenced by his archbishop in 1942. Desecration of synagogues and regular attacks on Jews continued through the war years. British anti-Semitism existed on the right-wing fringe, but this was marginalized in the late 1930s, and in 1940, activists from the British Union of Fascists were interned. It is nevertheless evident that many politicians and officials in the West who confronted the Jewish question did so from a position of prejudice or intolerance, as did much of the public. The stereotypical view of the Jew provoked a passive anti-Semitism that adversely affected the prospect of a more positive response to the Jewish crisis. Anthony Eden, who masterminded the declaration in December 1942, has told his private secretary a year before, "If we must have preferences, I prefer Arabs to Jews." It's the same even now. The officials in the Foreign Office and Colonial Office who had to deal with Palestine or the refugee problem peppered their minutes with a casual racism. "In my opinion," wrote one in 1944, "a disproportionate amount of the time of this office is wasted on dealing with these wailing Jews." Churchill was unusual among his cabinet colleagues in his unconcealed support for Zionism and his concern for the Jewish people caught in the Axis net, but he was unable during the war to overturn the indifference or hostility of those around him. Roosevelt, by contrast, did little to address the problem of Jewish refugees or to respond to the Jewish crisis unless he felt that public opinion required it. In the end, substituting political calculation for humanitarian concern.